By Christmas 1914, the armies of Europe had completely bogged down and fighting had spread to Russia, Africa, and the Middle East. The empires drew on their colonies for manpower. 60 countries were eventually represented in the conflict. The Germans had expected to win in 42 days, but they had not anticipated what would happen on the Western Front in France. On the Western Front, the German assault had finally failed, and soldiers on both sides had raced to dig an elaborate trench system that stretched for 300 miles, from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. On New Year's Day in 1915, the young men who had gone off to fight glorious battles were now trapped in a desperate war of attrition.
Someone said to us excitedly, "Jack Smith." I said, "What about him?" "He's dead, he's been shot. The first one of the battalion to be shot." I said, "What?" "Yes, he's dead, been shot. He put his head too far over and a sniper got him." And that caused a bit of a sensation amongst the lads. They thought, well, this is not exactly what we come for kind of business. But later on, from that day onwards, when we went to the trenches, it was 3 killed, 4 killed, 5 killed, 20 killed, 100 killed. By then, we was veterans.
A young American poet, Alan Seeger, was among those looking for adventure when he joined the Foreign Legion to fight for France. His diary reveals how seldom he found it.
It's a miserable life, shivering in these wretched holes in the dirt. We're not leading the life of men at all, but that of animals, living in our holes in the ground, and only showing our heads outside to fight and to feed.
When we'd been there about 6 months, covered in mud, wet through practically all day, absolutely chewed up my lice, we used to say, and to think we wanted to come to this hole. I said, yes, we didn't know.
Every so often, one side or the other seized a few hundred yards of territory only to be forced back again, surrendering what had cost hundreds of lives to win. The front never moved more than a mile or two in either direction. By the spring of 1915, the generals had concluded that the best way out of the stalemate was to blast the enemy out of their trenches. The same factories and assembly lines that had begun to contribute to life in the 20th century were now retooled to create massive killing machines. This was the industrialization of war.
It was just the splintered trunks of trees, and there was the quagmire of the shell holes, and no grass. It was just like a lunar landscape, really.
And contributing to the stalemate were new weapons. By now, the machine gun had been perfected to the point that a single soldier could command as much firepower as 40 riflemen. The tank made its first appearance, invented by the British to get through the dense thickets of barbed wire that protected the enemy trenches. And in April 1915, the Germans introduced the most terrifying weapon of all, poison gas.
No one had ever seen it before. This is the moment when chemical warfare was invented. It scared the living daylights out of the Canadian troops that were hit by it.
The First World War had become a contest not of fighting spirit, but of technological might. And for the soldiers caught in the middle of it, there was no way forward and no way back. There was simply endurance.
You saw a little bush, and you swore that bush was somebody creeping up on you. The perfect soldier then in that war would have been somebody with no imagination whatsoever. We all had too much imagination.
So many men who had been through these dangers and anxieties, their nerve broke and they were the victims of shell shock, you know. There is a breaking point for most people, for everybody really. Robbed of all humanity and courage and everything else that makes life worth living, really. He's descended to something less than human.
The stalemate in the trenches continued through 1915 and into 1916, when the generals decided to go back to their original weapon, their men. The River Somme, northern France, early summer 1916. Along a front 25 miles wide, a massive Allied army prepared to attack. Thousands of British Tommies, as they were called, would lead the charge. And they would follow one of the most intense bombardments in the history of warfare, an artillery barrage that would last an entire week. The Battle of the Somme was about to begin.
There must be 1,000 guns if there was one. It was a terrible roar from morning till night. But the foolish officers said, "Tomorrow, boys, you'll be over the top, and don't worry," he says. "There'll be no trenches there. Our shells have blown to pieces. There'll be no Germans there. They're blown to pieces. All you have to do is to walk over and take those trenches. In fact," he says, "you can carry your rifle like a bag."
The Germans, after the shelling, they simply come out of the dugouts, grabbed their machine guns, and then waited for the Tommies. They just simply swathed them down, so you're cutting down grain. They didn't get 200 feet from the trench. One German machine gunner said, "I stopped firing because I was sickened by what we were doing."
It was the bloodiest day in British history. 20,000 men killed, 40,000 wounded. And yet, the day after, and for days after that, young men continued to be ordered out of their trenches and into near certain death. The poet volunteer, Alan Seeger, was killed on July the 4th. On the same morning, Ted Francis waited for the signal to go.
officers are down below us in the trenches with a whistle, and when they blow that whistle, we got to dash out of the trenches and make for this German Thames. And it is in those few 4 or 5 minutes that we look at each other and say, oh, well, now I shall do this. Some were visibly shaking, some were crying. And of course, when the whistle went, and we had to scramble over,
The Battle of the Somme would come to define the futility of the First World War. It went on for 6 more months at a cost of 1 million men. And at the end of it, the Allied armies had moved a grand total of 5 miles. The guns of the Somme were so loud and so insistent that they were heard across the English Channel in London, 150 miles away. In every country that was involved in the war, there were growing problems at home. After so many years of struggle, the disillusionment of the battlefront now extended to the home front. Russia, in particular, was ripe for revolution. Its people were starving, and its battered army was on the verge of defeat.